This is an interview for the Veterans History Project. My name is Ryan Honnell. And first we're going to start with some biographical information. Can you please state your full name?
My name is Richard D. Stacy.
And where were you born?
Cambridge, New York.
And who were your parents and what were their occupations?
Parents were Harold and Pearl Stacy. My father was a physician and my mother was a nurse.
Do you have any siblings?
I have an older sister, Jean Gore.
Did she serve in the military?
No, she did not. She was an Army brat, though.
So you traveled around a lot
Yes.
as a kid then? Any particular places that were memorable?
Fort Polk, Louisiana.
What made that memorable?
It was the third time my father was stationed there. He was stationed there in World War II as he was moving and training from the East Coast to the West Coast. They traveled the entire United States, and then he was stationed there second time when he came back on active duty, and that's where I graduated from high school in DeRidder, Louisiana, the third time he was stationed there.
Okay. What were your parents and siblings' feelings about you joining the service?
Coming as a military family, and I went into the medical arena because I was a medical service corps officer. My father was all for it, obviously. And actually, the story, my father left his private practice because he saw several of his friends die early of heart attacks and stress and strain. And I had an uncle who was a 06 full colonel in the artillery. And we spent time with them, and my mom and dad saw how much their family was a lot different and a little more relaxed and stuff, and they decided that maybe the military would be a better place to practice medicine.
What kind of jobs did you hold prior to entering the military, if any?
I went straight from high school into ROTC in college.
And where did you go to college?
Went to Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas.
Did you volunteer or were you drafted?
Volunteer.
What do you remember from talking to the recruiter?
Well, I actually never really talked to a recruiter. It was just obvious I selected Hardin-Simmons because I wanted to major in political science and history, and they had a very, very strong ROTC program, and so I selected it for that reason.
Okay, now we're going to transition into your time in service. What got you interested in the military?
Growing up as an Army brat and being stationed around various and sundry places, Fort Polk, Louisiana, Fort Lee, Virginia, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. Never got overseas as a dependent, but you just see that daily Army life, and my father was a career physician and usually was in command of something. So I saw it from an entirely different perspective and understood the significance of being a good healthcare provider in the military and how important that was to support the troops.
And when did you go into the military?
I entered active duty and actually was commissioned by my father on June 8th, 1971.
Can you tell us about when you went into the active military?
I entered in June 8th, 1971, and 30 days later I was in officer basic training at Fort Sam Houston, Texas.
And how did you get to your initial point of entry from college?
I'm quite
Did you fly there, or
Oh,
did you?
I drove.
You drove?
Yeah.
Do you recall your first few days of service?
Sure.
And what did that feel like?
I think ROTC prepared me for it, to understand that we were being trained to be officers, and in the Army Medical Department, the same is true. I was there to learn how to be a 3506, which was a medical service corps officer, which was referred to as a jack of all trades, master of none, in terms of providing support to maneuver units with quality health care.
And you said you went to officer basic training. What was your first experience with a training instructor?
Well, it was kind of like going to college again, because we all were TDY and lived off post. So we didn't live in a barracks and didn't eat in a mess hall or anything else. We showed up at class every morning in formation at 08 and had classes all day long, and left at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and came back the next day and did that for about 12 weeks.
Okay. What was it like to go through that training at Officer Basic?
It was reinforcing what I had learned in ROTC. I was in a military fraternity in college, Pershing Rifles, and was on the drill team. So I learned about discipline and confidence as a freshman way more longer than anybody else in ROTC, unless you were in those kinds of environments. And I was with young men who were all dedicated to going to Vietnam. And our whole primary goal and purpose in life was to learn how to do our jobs the best we could do.
How did you get through that training?
Prayer, but understanding the significance of it. And I once again would chat with my father, who served in World War II in the Battle of the Bulge and in Patton's medical unit as a physician, listening to his war stories from the 11th Armored Division, and actually going to a couple of his reunions, thinking about all the things that they dealt with. And he was one of the first physicians in World War II to go into a prisoner or a Jewish war camp, where you just couldn't believe the pictures and the horrified treatment that people got. But just listening to my father talk about him taking care of troops.
And you say you were in the Medical Service Corps?
Medical Service Corps.
And why did you choose that?
But all the other branches in the Army Medical Department require a professional degree. The dentists, physicians, nurses, ophthalmologists, optometrists, social workers. It was a basic thing to go in and be an administrative person supporting a battalion surgeon, basically. And I actually went to battalion surgeon assistant school because that would have been my job in Vietnam, to be working with battalion surgeon.
And while you were in officer training, what's the most vivid memory for you?
Going out on field exercises and being with people who had never even held a compass in their life and learn how to navigate and orient. And I felt good because I actually knew how to do that because I learned it on ROTC. So I shared my talents with my peers.
Any particular stories about that, of people that were struggling?
Well, we were at Camp Bullis, which is out near San Antonio, and you could get lost out in the wilderness of that part of Texas. And just getting to say, you got to trust the compass, you got to trust the compass, and you got to understand the topographical map. And they go, you're not talking Greek to us, come on, get us home somehow. But we made it back.
Does any particular instructor from officer training stand out in your mind?
Not in an officer basic. When I went to the officer advanced course, I had an instructor who his famous words were, "Trust me." And he taught statistics, and he said, "I know you might understand it, but just trust me." And that has stuck with me for a long time. Is the whole aspect of you got to learn how to trust people.
What was your first assignment after training?
My first assignment was with the 1st Cavalry Division, 15th Medical Battalion at Fort Hood. They had just rotated back from Vietnam and were now the part of the Test and Contingency Division to start experimenting with the TRICAP concept of using, and that's where the 6th Air Cavalry Combat Brigade originated, actually, using helicopters in close proximity to straight leg infantry units and armor units. So we had all those in the division. So we did not have a wartime mission, actually. It was kind of interesting. The closest thing we got to war was during one of the political conventions. We sat on the runway at the airfield at Fort Hood, potentially having to deploy down to Florida in case there was an insurrection. And I don't remember whether it was the Democratic Convention or the Republican Convention, but spent long hours sitting on the hot runway waiting for the airplanes to come in if we had to deploy.
Were there any incidents in that at all?
No, we never left Fort Hood.
Okay. And what type of specialized training or schooling did you have while in the military?
Well, following my officer basic as a medical service corps officer, learning how to deal with medical units in a med battalion, I also went to battalion surgeon assistance course, which was an 8-week course. We referred to it as 8 weeks of medical school, where I actually learned how to take history, medical histories, start IVs, do a cricothyroidotomy if you stop breathing. I've always wanted to do one. I haven't gotten a chance to do one yet. So I still used to carry a pen barrel around so I could stuff it in the hole, but I don't do that anymore.
Just like you see in the movies. Had you ever heard of that happening in real life?
Oh yeah, yeah. But we were taught all kinds of things, wound management and things, anything to help the battalion surgeon in terms of treating warriors.
Okay. And you said you helped the battalion surgeon. What exactly was your role?
I was never assigned to that. When I left Officer Basic and graduated from that course, and I went to Fort Hood, there were 22 second lieutenants assigned to the 15th Medical Battalion, and it's only authorized 12. So my first duty assignment in the 15th Med Battalion was I was the S2, the intelligence officer, which they're not authorized on their TO&E. It's an S2, S3 position. So I learned about intelligence and communications and supporting DISCOM, the Division Support Command, and the maneuver units of the 3 brigades that we had, because each one of our medical companies was designed to support even infantry, armor, or the Air Cavalry Combat Brigade.
You mentioned S2 and S3. What do those stand for?
S2 is the operations officer, and S3 is the, S2 is the intelligence officer, and S3 is the operations officer. So as an S2, I learned how to maintain the communication codes every day and verify when we get on the net and get off the radio net so that we can maintain security that way.
What kind of equipment did you qualify with?
Qualified with a 45 pistol, which was my TO&E assigned weapon.
And what is TONE?
Table of Organizational and Equipment that stresses how many people should be in the unit and what their equipment level is and how many weapons you need to have and all of that. And that was one of the things I did is I had to inspect the arms rooms, make sure that all the weapons were stored and triple locked and those kinds of things. And I always remember the first time I went around, there was we were supposed to have this high security padlock that slid over the hasp, and they were on back order. They'd been on back order for 2 years. And so the NCO that came and inspected told me, he said, you don't need to worry about that as long as you've got a requisition. So the next time that they came to inspect, I stuck the requisition in the hasp and said, this is in lieu of my back ordered lock. He didn't see the humor in it, actually.
What was the hardest part of all your training?
I don't think I ever saw it as a hard part. I saw it as a challenge. But striving for that opportunity to learn and know that I was going to be a constant learner from that day forward. Continuously learning how to be a better officer, how to do my job better, and how to relate to my peers.
And you said you initially served with the 1st Cavalry Division.
Yeah, 1st Cavalry Division.
Did you serve with any other units while you were in?
I was assigned to, let's have to think of my order. So I went from Fort Hood to, and went to Darnell Army Hospital, which is now Darnell Army Medical Center at Fort Hood, which is not Fort Hood anymore, actually, given they changed the name. And I don't remember what the new name is. While I was there, I was the assistant adjutant for the hospital and as the public affairs officer. And while I was there, I got selected to be a general's aide to the commanding general of Systems Army Medical Center in Denver. So I served in Denver, then went to officer advanced course and went to Korea, which was my terminal assignment for my active duty time.
What can you tell me about your time in Korea?
In Korea, I was assigned to Camp Carroll, which is midway between Pusan, which they now refer to as Busan, and the DMZ, Seoul area. And it was the headquarters for the Transportation Corps, which my wife had been a Transportation Corps officer. That's where about a battalion, 2 battalions of trucks were to move stuff from the port in Busan up to the Z. And I was the executive officer of the medical detachment there that ran the dispensary.
Did you get the opportunity to work with any South Korean military folks?
Yes, I had. The South Korean government has a program with the military, the U.S. Army called KATUSIS, which is Korean augmentation to the United States services. I had 4 medics that were Korean enlisted personnel who got there probably because of their family's wealth, not by any other stretch of the imagination. And our job was to teach them how to be a 91 Alpha, a basic medic, And one of my jobs was to teach him English for 2 hours a week, which was kind of an interesting assignment. But fortunately, my lab manager was a Korean civilian who spoke flawless English and flawless Korean, and so he would help me translate and such, and so it worked out fine. But got to know the young men. They were glad to be in the U.S. Army military because we treated them decently. There were stories of first sergeants in the Korean Army that were not necessarily humanistic to their young soldiers.
Were you able to travel to any other countries while you were in South Korea?
Not as an active duty officer, but as a dependent. My parents were stationed outside the United States while in my 4 years in college. And my dad was the United Nations command surgeon in Korea for my first 2 years in college, for my second 2 years in college. And he was worked on the Panama Canal survey, sea level survey command for 2 years while I was in college.
What rank did your dad leave the military?
He was retired as an 06 full colonel.
And while you were, did you have the same specific job at all of your postings?
No, because I worked in the medical research and development arena as well, and I was a manpower management officer, and we were determining what kinds of scientific specialists we needed to work on research in support of the military. And one of the laboratories you see in a lot of movies, USAMRI, which is the Medical Infectious Disease Institute at Fort Detrick, Maryland. But we had 7 other labs here in the United States and 4 or 5 labs outside the United States that were doing research in support of soldiers in the field.
And what specific kind of research did you do?
Well, for instance, at Fort Rucker, Alabama, there was the optics lab, and learning how to make sure people could see. They were learning how to fly Napa the Earth and using laser beams and such. So we were building optics to protect people from lasers direct in the eye. Same thing with tanks, using laser sighting vehicles and wearing appropriate safety glasses for those kind of things. They developed a reverse osmosis treatment facility, or piece of equipment that would rehydrate dried blood, because we were researching how to keep blood viable longer in the combat. And I always remember I was TDY visiting the laboratory at Madigan in San Francisco, and they had this big contraption. It looked like a still, basically, in the lab. And at one end it was urine that they had been collecting, and at the other end was potable water coming out to, and that's what we were toasting the success to, was drinking the potable water coming from the osmosis machine.
So that worked, turning urine into water.
Yep, and it fitted on a small trailer that you could tow in a quarter-ton vehicle. So it was kind of exciting. There's all kinds of things. That's a lot of the vaccine research is done at USAMRIID, and there's a long history of military being involved in those kinds of things like polio and salt vaccine and those kinds of things. So it was an exciting. Every lab was a little bit different. Down in San Antonio at the Brooke Army Medical Center was the burns unit, which was a part of our laboratory system. And that's where the worst burn cases used to go and rehab them back to a viable life. And that was an interesting place to visit as well. So every place that I had, and you just learn the intelligence of the scientific community in terms of them delivering things to the warriors to make their life a better life.
Did you see any? Did that help any veterans that had come back from Vietnam with injuries?
I'm not aware of whether there was any veteran. They were being air evac'd in, and so it would have been taken care of there. Just like even in when I was stationed at Walter Reed, or I wasn't stationed at Walter Reed, but it was a private consultant, used to see them coming back from Afghanistan and such. The military spares no expense to make sure that the warriors and the veterans are taken care of based upon their war needs.
What was the hardest part of military lifestyle for you to adapt to?
I learned early on that you made the most of what your life was like. We traveled. I went to 4 or 5 different schools, not as many as a lot of my peers had, but we were brought up as a family unit. And even today, I see my sister a lot more because she lives where I live in the wintertime in Texas. But I would go periods of time where I hadn't seen her for months. We just pick up right where we left off, which is how you kind of live your life when your father is on alert to go anywhere in the world. And my dad used to travel specifically to different areas to help the Surgeon General. So.
And while you were in Korea, what was the specific unit that you served with?
I was with the 15th Medical Detachment, which was a part of the United Nations and the U.S. Army Medical Command in Korea.
What was the Army food like in training, or did you have any field rations?
Well, we had sea rations, and of course, part of being in the R&D command is we were involved with a little bit of the leaping over into the food service side of making sure things were nutritional and such. So as they were developing the irradiated rations now, where you stick them in boiling water and cook them and things, food kept getting better and better and better. But sea rations, I still remember, is like opening up a can of rancid meat and having to eat it with a piece of bread that was kind of stale.
Did you do anything unusual to make it easier to eat?
No, not really.
You didn't mix anything together with something else? No.
We ate really well in the field because the battalion commander was also the division surgeon, and we inspected all the other mess halls and such. And so we always had our mess steward always had a good menu for us in the field, and good SOS. And such for keeping your ribs stuck together and things.
What does SOS stand for?
I can't say on camera.
You can't? Okay. We won't go there.
If we're talking to veteran warriors, they'll know what SOS
They'll
is.
know exactly what that is. How did people entertain themselves in the various units that you were in?
Well, when I came in, I was in the Volar Army, so it was kind of like not a country club necessarily, but at the end of the day, you weren't necessarily had to stay on the installation. And so people with my experience in my first 2 years was at Fort Hood. They would be in Killeen or one of the other surrounding areas of Fort Hood and just living life they had. They had the enlisted club, and they had the NCO club and the officers club, the movie theaters and those kind of things. So we didn't see a whole lot of, it was, just a regular kind of life, and it was an 8 to 5 job. I don't want to but that's kind of how we operated, unless we were going to be in a 24-hour operation and going to the field. And we went to the field a lot, so.
And what did you do for fun while you were in South Korea? Did you ever go to Seoul or any other places like that?
When we needed, I became good friends with the dental officer that was in my clinic, and the garrison company commander, and the chief of the highway patrol and military police. And those two gentlemen, the garrison company commander and the MP, were both West Point graduates, so we had a lot of fun harassing them. And I know you're a West Point grad too, and listening to life stories about being a West Point cadet. But I used to cook for them. I said, I'll cook for you if you'll do the dishes. And so I would take their chits so I could go to the commissary and buy food, and then I'd come back, and every night I'd cook a meal for them because we got tired of eating at the officers club every night. So, and I still have kind of lost contact with them, but for the first 5 or 10 years coming out of Korea, I used to maintain contact with them, but all of them are out in the military now, so.
Did you ever have any contact with the USO or any other organizations like that?
Yeah, I had contact with them on a couple of different occasions. The biggest one was Bob Hope when I was stationed at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center, and I was the aide-de-camp to the commanding general, so I coordinated his visit. And it was the first USO show that he did not go overseas because we were in the drawdown of Vietnam. And the reason why he came to Denver is that was the beginning of NBC. NBC had the first channel in Denver, and he had some money involved in it. And so he would come back and visit, and he used it as the Air Force had a plane at his disposal anytime he wanted to fly anywhere. And so as long as he said, I'm coming to do a USO show, they would fly and pick him up and fly him to wherever he needed to go. And so I met him at the Air National Guard base that he landed outside of Denver. And my first job, he introduced me to one of the young females that was traveling with him, and he said, can you find her some lower false eyelashes? She left them in Los Angeles. Now, I didn't even know there was such a thing as lower false eyelashes, but I learned that there are, and they're not necessarily the right ones. When you just go to one store, you have to find the right store for the right brand.
Wow, so you actually got to hang out with Bob Hope.
Yes.
Can you say anything about Bob Hope?
He is exactly what you see. He's larger than life, but very dedicated to the military. And we put him up at he was only there overnight. He wasn't there overnight. He flew in the day before, and he was staying at a hotel. When he did the show at night, he was leaving and going back to Los Angeles. But we put him up at the Officers Club. We had visiting BOQ rooms there, and provided him a meal and such, and I had got a chance to have dinner with him, and he just talked about his experiences nonstop. But it's very accommodating, and it's a bad time because in a medical center like Fitzsimmons, we sent everybody that was ambulatory home on leave if they could go with their families, because Fitzsimmons was taking care of patients that were either orthopedic patients or psychiatric patients. Those were our two centers of excellence in providing care to warriors coming back from Vietnam.
Wow, that's amazing you got to meet Bob Hope.
Yes.
He goes way back to the Second World War,
Yes,
right?
he does.
He visited troops then, and wow. And I think he visited troops, he did in the Gulf War as well.
The Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders came to Korea, though. So.
Do you want to talk any more about that?
No, I don't, because my wife's in the room.
Because your wife is in the room, okay. What did you miss about being a civilian?
I never thought of myself being different than a civilian, so I use the term Army brat and I use the term warrior or officer, but we all are citizens, and that's all that counts.
Did you ever learn something out about a fellow service member that surprised you?
Oh, none that I can think of off the top of my head. Nothing. I try not to have anything surprise me. I kind of listen and rationalize. Okay, that makes sense, I guess. I will. My friend John, who was the Garrison Company commander, got a Dear John letter while we were in Korea.
Oh no!
And so I learned a lot about him and his marriage.
Wow. What was your most stressful experience while you were in the military?
That's another interesting question. I don't know whether I would ever overly stressed. I always like to make sure I was ready for everything and dealt with the stress, because you can't let your subordinates see that you're stressed. And that's not an easy thing to do. I always remember somebody telling me, I asked him once, what's the difference between getting paid $110 to jump out of a perfectly good airplane as an officer or $75 as an enlisted? And the command sergeant major says, because the officer breaks his leg, he has to get up and lead. And so I learned never to worry about being stressed, the job was to get up and lead.
And what was your rank when you left the service? We're transitioning to end of service now.
I left as a major.
Okay. Can you tell me about those promotions when you went because you went from lieutenant to captain, then captain to major?
Went from second lieutenant to first lieutenant in 18 months. Went to captain in 24 months after that. And actually, as I ETS'd, I stayed in the reserves as a Mob Des and got promoted about 2 weeks after I left active duty to major.
Okay. What medals or citations did you earn?
I have a couple of Archons and a couple of MSMs.
And what do those stand for?
Army Commendation Medal, which is recognizing for contributions to the Army, at a lower level, and then meritorious service award, which is similar but a little bit higher, elevated. And the difference is a general officer signs off on the MSM and a 06 can sign off on the RCOM.
Okay. Do you recall the day your active service ended?
Yeah, I do, because I went on terminal leave when I decided to leave the military. And so the last day was we made sure we went to the PX and commissary and stocked up on what we needed, because we weren't sure how we were going to live without the commissary. There is life after the commissary and PX.
What do you miss about your time in the service?
I miss the camaraderie that I had with my troops and fellow officers and such. Never have experienced that the same way, because there's not that, in the military there's a unifying force of mission. I've never seen that in any private sector or civilian organization I was in. Tried to bring some of that to the organization and create that kind of culture. And in my consulting, that's the kind of consulting I did. It was organizational development consulting and quality management consulting, and had a chance to work with the military as a consultant as well. So I had an extended career. So I never really stopped being in the military, actually, because one of the reasons that I got selected, my first job was because I was a former officer. And I found that the lady individual that hired me, my three predecessors were all former Army officers. And her husband was a retired full colonel. And she found that officers knew how to lead.
Wow. Did you go on to any further education after the service?
Completed my master's degree while I was on active duty, and then did doctoral studies in educational psychology.
Okay. Now we're going to move on to reflections of your service. What was the best part of your service experience?
Having a new opportunity to learn something almost every single day. No matter what I had planned to do that day, I always had something that took me off, and something I had not even anticipated. And it was a learning and growth experience on a daily basis. And I was very lucky as a second lieutenant to be assigned to the battalion headquarters as the intelligence officer. And our operations officer was one of those E8 first sergeant types that knew everything in the military. And the command sergeant major knew my father. And so they kind of took me under their wing and made sure that I learned how to be a good officer.
Okay. What are some life lessons you learned from your military service?
You got to trust people. People will do what you ask them to do if you ask them and give them right direction.
And how has your military service impacted your feelings about war in the military in general?
It's very disturbing to me, especially in today. Here we are in 2023, and we have a civilian population that knows very little about the military, and we've lost all of our civility in terms of how we deal with each other, and we don't even agree to disagree anymore, because there's no disagreement. It's only I'm the right way is this way, kind of thing, and that's very disturbing to me. And as I guess I see the daily activities of people's lack of knowledge of the military, if they only understood how the military actually works, we would be a lot better off.
What message would you like to leave for future generations who will see this interview?
It's important to be patriotic. It's important to serve your nation. I get goosebumps here in Roseau every Memorial Day service, and I have the privilege of being one of the two readers of the honor roll. That's a very, very, very positive experience of patriotism, of remembering those. And every Christmas we go and lay wreaths at the military cemetery in Abilene and salute a former hero.
Are you married?
Yes, I am.
And where did you meet your spouse?
I met my spouse while I was on active duty, and she was also on active duty at Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center.
Do you have any advice for military couples that are veterans now or serve together while in the military?
The military is challenging because the one thing that it has more frequently than not is the moving around aspect. My wife was a transportation corps officer. I was a medical service corps officer. And one day, we had been dating for about 4 or 5 months, and she called me one day and said, I just got orders to go to Fort Eustis to teach at the school. And she said, what do you think we should do? And I said, I think we could get married or something. And she said, I'll think on that. Let me get back to you later on today. That was my proposal.
So how did that work out for you?
Well, after 2 hours of explanation of her thought processes, she said, I do.
What's it like to be married to a veteran?
It's funny because both of us have been members of the Post 24 here in Roseau, Minnesota for 35 plus years. And we actually now spend time here where we actually interact with the Post. Before we were absentee members. And it's funny to watch the auxiliary because they still can't get over that there's a female that served in the military. And they go, you go to the meetings with men?
All right, we're going to move into concluding questions. What would you like people to know or remember from your story?
The military presents endless opportunities for you to grow as an individual and make all kinds of contributions to the overall success of this country.
And what do you wish more people knew about veterans?
I wish they would understand that they did their service because that's what they were meant to be doing. That it's not an extraordinary experience for most veterans. It's something that was just done. I still have a hard time reacting when people said, thank you for your service. It's kind of like, what else would I have done?
Is there anything else that you've wanted to share about your service that you've never shared with anybody?
No, I think I've pretty much shared everything that need to say.
And what did you do with your life after you served?
Opened and started a consulting practice, and ultimately my wife joined me after she left her consulting world in national defense contractors. And we made a very nice duo of husband and wife, veterans, and we got a lot of our jobs because we were veterans. And it's fun to work together with your spouse and do. Now we're quasi-retired. We still teach graduate level courses with the University of Colorado Boulder online in a master's program we help design.
Okay. And the last question I have for you, is there anything you'd like to add that we didn't cover in this interview?
I think you did a pretty comprehensive job, Ryan. I appreciate the opportunity to sit and chat with you today.
Well, thanks for your service to the nation, and this concludes the interview.